A Lancaster Amish Home for Jacob by Rachel Stoltzfus. Preview of Chapter 1. If you like this preview, you can grab the whole book for free by clicking on the link in the description. This book is free on Kindle, Nook, iBooks, Kobo, Page Foundry and Oyster. Chapter 1. Run! Charles shouted, but Jacob was already running, feet pounding against the broken concrete. He was heading at breakneck speed in the direction of what he knew to be an abandoned building. Quickly, he grabbed onto a loose drain pipe adjacent to the building's fire escape and began to climb. While others might find this sort of climb incredibly difficult, he always found it fun. The city was full of amazing obstacles, and he loved finding new ways to get around. On most nights, they were able to do this without so much as a glance from the police, or anyone else for that matter. But on this particular night, Charles had suggested they bring a couple of cans of aerosol paint and work their magic on a car. They had been very proud of their work, but it did not seem anyone else was, especially the person. If they were lucky tonight, very lucky, they might manage to slip through the unlocked window at the inner city group home without getting nabbed by the police. If they were even luckier, they might be able to slip into their rooms and into their beds without being noticed. It was more possible than it seemed, actually. They had done it a million times before, though Jacob wished Sherry were with them tonight. She was so much better at planning, strategy and getting out of things. No sooner were they on the fire escape than they dived through an open window into what they had surmised was an abandoned factory. With any luck, the police outside would simply forget about them. It had happened before. After all, the factory was huge, and as Jacob made his way to the next floor he was not intimidated in the least by the red and blue strobes flashing just beyond the foggy windows. He had been in here a million times before, maybe 1,000,001. Finding a place to hide was going to be easy. Over here. Charles whispered. He'd found an old cabinet, lined with grease, but still a decent hiding place. It was better than nothing. That was for sure. Jacob made a beeline toward the cabinet, following Charles in so that he could close the flimsy metal door behind them. "Don't close it all the way," Charles hissed. "If it locks and we die in here, I'm going to kill you." Jacob held on to the edge of the door with 3 fingers, keeping the gap wide enough to see, but not so wide as to allow anyone to see in. As he expected, no one came to this floor, but he could hear the sound of metal doors being swung aside and footsteps on the floor below. With any luck, the footsteps stopped momentarily, and Jacob's heart skipped as the unthinkable happened. They began to come up the stairs. Jacob and Charlie had both played in this particular factory over the years often enough to know the layout. If the police came up those stairs, they would first encounter a door, and after that door, they would be on what Jacob had always thought to be a factory floor. There were 1,000,000 cabinets in here, at least, so the odds of their actually being found were slim to none. But it still made him incredibly nervous. He glanced toward the back of the cabinet, expecting to see Charles, but all he saw was darkness. "Shh," Charles said. He was probably placing a finger over his lips. It was at this moment that Jacob realized there was not nearly enough room in the cabinet for both of them. His legs were at an odd, uncomfortable angle, and he was sure he felt Charles' foot in his bum. In addition to that, he was sure he felt something dared not move. A single sound could easily give away their position, and the last thing he wanted to do was spend the night in a police station. He'd been there and done that plenty of times. He thought for a moment at how angry, or annoyed, his social worker, Carol, would be. She'd be furious if she found out he'd pulled this crap again. Not that it mattered in the end. The footsteps came nearer, and for the first time Jacob could see light outside of the cabinet. He squinted, trying to figure out just where that light was coming from while remaining as quiet as possible. Maybe, just maybe, the cops would go away if they didn't hear anything. It was a long shot, though. The cops pretty much never went away on their own. He gritted his teeth and clenched his fist. At any minute, back at the group home, someone would check their beds, and the policy when one was found empty was to call the police. The home might not have been a jail, but it was the closest thing to it. Jacob remembered very clearly the last time he'd been in a predicament like this one. He'd been told he was lucky, extremely lucky, that the jails were full, otherwise he'd have been occupying his very own 8x4 concrete hotel room. But Jacob had never been much for threats. And he didn't consider this much of one. How much worse could it possibly get? He peeked through the crack once again, and nearly jumped out of his skin when he saw a pair of blue legs standing right outside the cabinet. He stopped everything. He stopped moving. This all seemed very surreal, but in his mind, he was very aware of the situational severity. That was something that had always amused him, actually, being dragged into the administrator's office after every escapade and being accused of not thinking about the consequences of his actions. That could not be further from the truth. He always thought about the consequences, and was more than aware of them. It was simply that he did not care. And why should he? No one seemed to care about him, after all. If they did, he'd be living with a family instead of in a crappy group home. Not that he needed a family. But in all of his 13 years, no one had seemed interested in fostering him, and when potential foster parents wandered the halls, he often felt like a dog at the shelter. They didn't take more than a glance at him. He was trouble. He looked like trouble. His file said he was trouble. It was 6 inches thick, or so he had been told, and the workers at the group home said he was trouble. The truth never seemed to matter, though the truth was, simply, that he was trouble, even if it was only a self-fulfilling maybe. Jacob thought to himself, just maybe the police officer would give up the search and go back to whatever donut shop he'd come from, and then, just maybe, he and Charles could sneak back into their room and, for once, be exactly where they were supposed to be in the morning. Turning over a new leaf seemed like the thing to do about now. As these thoughts raced through his mind, he heard the last thing he ever wanted to hear from Charles' mouth: sorry. Charles had just uttered an actual apology, something that he would never do under normal circumstances. Suddenly, and without warning beyond that half-hearted apology, Charles kicked him. The force sent him flying out of the cabinet and sprawling across the concrete floor with a yelp. Immediately, the flashlight beam was on him, and the voice of several police officers echoed throughout the factory floor. Freeze! Put your hands on your head! One of them shouted. Jacob couldn't tell whether they were in a terrible mood or simply excited at the prospect of having something to do. Or both. Both might definitely be worse. Thank you for enjoying a preview of A Lancaster Amish Home for Jacob by Rachel Stoltzfus. If you like this book so far, you can grab the whole book for free by clicking on the link in the description. This book is free on Kindle, Nook, iBooks, Kobo, Page Founder.